Good morning. This is Wednesday, the 20th of September. A small group here of members from the Amateur Radio Club of Alameda, ARCA, is here this morning to hear a version 1.2 of a presentation I gave on Saturday, right in this very room, although I didn't have a whiteboard. I've added a few slides, and a few pieces of information have come to me since then. So I thought I would more or less repeat what I did on Saturday. Some of you know that I like to remote operate. These days, when you got an internet that works, that's the catch, you can get on radios all over the world. Now, a lot of these are subscription-based. They charge you literally by the hour. They charge you some fee to get in their database, and then they charge you by the hour. And a typical contest weekend, you'd probably end up spending $600 of connect time. So what is nice is if you have access to sites like I do, the exchange is that I'm a pretty good operator. I've often joked that the only reason November X-Ray 6 Tango lets me play in their radio sport events is because I'm the one that's willing to do the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. shift, or 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. In fact, I'm working on, from the boat, I want to remote in to NX6T on the weekend, and I got a hunch they're going to ask me to do 2 to 4 a.m. remote. But also, you can get a chance to see live remote during that contest. My setup is in Concord at W7AYT, Alpha Yankee Tango. I have one of the bedrooms there, and my current radio setup involves a FT2000 transceiver. One of the things I like about it is that you can CAT control it. CAT means computer assisted transceiver. In other words, you can run it, you can trigger it by the computer. Just for the hell of it, I'm going to turn the power. Let's try that again. I'm going to turn the power on. All right. Let me see. Are we? Oh, we are on. If you look very closely, you can see the S meter wiggling over there. Let me go on to 40 meters. There we are. Now we're on 40 meters. Now I'm probably not tuned up, so I'm going to hit the MOX button. I'll explain that later. And my IntelliTuner, this 994B, is going to sense the RF. It already has in one of its memories this area of the band. So when I went and gave it power, boom, it went boom, and then it was all tuned. That's how quickly an auto tuner can be once you programmed it for that frequency. Now what if we go to, I don't have audio that I can hear from here today, but that's okay. But this is to show you essentially that we can run radios remotely. I'm going to show you the unit that I use a little later. And let's see, I believe that's all we need for this time. But this computer, I can link up to my office computer from it. I can link up to another computer in the Concord site. I have 4 computers now in a network. The software I'm using is called VNC Viewer, Victor November Charlie Viewer. I have a cheap subscription so that I can have a lot of computers tied in. So let's get us out of this mess. Okay. There's my friend Natalie Tran. She is a riot. She's an Australian Vietnamese girl. 10 years ago was making her own YouTube videos on totally inane subjects, and she nails the weirdness of the life that we lead. So sometimes I pay attention to what she's up to. She cracks me up. Okay, now, the next thing from last weekend, we were talking just before today about CQP, the California QSO Party. That is coming up the first full weekend in October. I believe Rose said it was October 6th and 7th. For CQP, I like to get to the site a couple of days in advance. In field day, they have a restriction. You can't start setting up equipment more than 24 hours before field day. California QSO Party, they don't care. I have run the QSO Party with a lot of weird call signs over the years. This, when we get our screen back, this was 2 years ago. The Amateur Radio Club of Alameda, we put together our first California QSO Party. It was largely Roger and myself doing the operating. We had a gentleman sitting in the back who I don't remember his name, but he just sucked on brewskis the entire time. He was a happy guy. He loved watching us. We held this event at the California Historical Radio Society over on Central Avenue, just around the corner from my office, no less. We ran the call sign, kilowatt 6, Quebec, London, Foxtrot. Whoa, try that again. Kilowatt 6, Quebec, London, Foxtrot. Does anybody know what the Q code QLF stands for? In amateur radio, we use a Q code, QRM, QRN, QRT, etc. QLF means your Morse code sending is so bad that you're sending with your left foot. You must be using your left foot. Well, this club got that call sign. Now, is that cool or what? Well, then Roger, getting bored with his old call, I don't even remember what it was, he started looking around, and he discovered that W6 QLF was available. So Roger is now W6 QLF, but he's living in W2 land. So technically he's W6 QLF portable too. We ran the ICOM 7000. They lent us a power supply. Physically, this was a wonderful location. Electrically, it was horrible. Because upstairs, probably 50 feet as the crow flies from where our radios were, is all their electronic repair equipment. And of course, it's on a weekend, and these guys do equipment repair on weekends. So we got nothing but RFI all over the place. At 8:30, they shut the building down and went home, and it got, boom, immediately silent. So this year we're talking about doing CQP from the Oakland Yacht Harbor. And my proposal is as follows. I'm going to run my call sign, WQ6X, as a QRP station, 5 watts, from a boat here somewhere. We're going to figure that out. Then, on Saturday, I'm proposing that we set up a station right here on this table where we were before. You gave us a trial run on Saturday, so we'll set it up. We'll figure out some sort of an antenna. And the goal then is, and between now and then I need to find a computer that'll run your radio, because the goal is for me to sit down behind your radio and make 10 or 15 or 20 contacts, and you all can watch how I do it. And all of a sudden the light bulb's gonna go on and you're gonna go, well, I can do that. Yeah, of course you can. All you gotta say is, WQ6X, you're number 42 from Alameda County. Can you say that? I knew you could. So that's basically it. And then, whenever you guys break down, I'm going to, from the boat, use the club call sign K6QLF on CW. So I'm going to be, you guys are going to be the sideband, I'm going to be the CW. And Tom, if you can get on the air at all with the club call sign here, what I'd like to do after we're done today is go to the cqp.org website, and I will register all three of us. I will register my QRP operation, I will register our club operation, and I will register your OIC. Now, your station is already here, so you're just a normal station. But technically, you and I, because our equipment is not set up here, we qualify to be what's called an expedition station. So you're actually going to be doing an expedition to the Oakland Yacht Club. Why not, right? I'm going to be doing an expedition to some boat around here. The rule, when in doubt, cheat, but within the rules. And if you read the rules, and CQP is nasty on rules. They have updated a couple this year. Pissed me off, but don't get me started. But according to the rules, all that has to happen is for our equipment to be within 1,000-foot radius. Is it 1,000? Less than 1,000 feet from here to some boat over here?
Probably.
Yeah, there you go. So as long as our equipment is all within that radius, K6QLF can be on a boat or it can be in this room. And CQP starts at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning. So I'll start at 9 a.m. here, get you guys going. When you're confident and that you can kick me out, then I'm going to trundle off down to the boat and I'm going to start running WQ6XQRP. And I'll be running CW, and knowing more or less, we should probably have HT 146, what is it, 535 communication, so we can talk to each other, and you can just tell me what band you're on so that I don't inadvertently encroach on you. You guys are a higher priority than I am. But this is a typical, this by the way, was an expedition, because we set up on their picnic table out behind the Radio Society. I often write this stuff up in my blog, wq6x.blogspot.com. I'm a little behind on posts, but there's going to be a flood in about a week. And this is a typical write-up for, this is, by the way, what my station looks like in Concord, more or less. I've made a few changes since then. Oh, it's a picture. Well, whatever. And here we are with a California county map. Does anybody know how many counties are in California?
52.
Close. I was in the Texas QSO party this weekend. They have like 242 counties.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that. We have 58.
58.
Now, and there may be a new shift this year, but until this year, turns out there are 58 states and provinces in Canada. Our state, 50 states and 8 provinces in Canada, so that's an exact number with the number of counties here in California. But they did some weird thing to splitting up something, so it may now be 59 that we're trying to get. We're trying to get as many states and provinces as we can, and they're trying to get as many California counties as they can. And some years, the CQP people put bonuses together. They'll register call signs like W6A and K6M, and if those letters spell out a word, in 2015, if you could make contacts with stations that spelled out Gold Rush, you got you got something, I forget what it was. But my friend George and I, November 6th, George Echo Oscar, he got me into all this CQP mess, really. We've done a number of expeditions. And this is just some of the expeditions that I've done over the years. These pictures on the top are with George, M6GEO. He and I go back to high school together, so we've been around for a while. He let me set up in his cabin in Twain Harte 1 year by myself, which I did. I just bought a new transceiver, and then I played other games here as well. These are all expeditions. I have remote access to a station in Ramona. This is the antenna in Ramona. This is a picture, this picture was actually when we were in Fallbrook. So right there is 70 feet high at the apex. Currently today I think he has it lowered down to 55 feet. And when there was the threat of the hurricane, they knocked it down to 22 feet. So my 80-meter dipole was kind of drooping, and I couldn't get out on 80 for a few nights. But this is how I run remote. Here in Concord, I'm running what's called a K30. That looks like a K3 radio, except that it's an empty box, just the front panel of the K3. But that, through a box behind the scenes, gives me a hookup to the internet, and for CQP a few years ago, I was able to remote in and run this radio right here in Fallbrook, and we were running as K6A, kilowatt 6 alpha. I had registered that for myself, and the CQP people called me and said, would you mind giving it to the San Diego Contest Club? And I said no, because then I can operate. That's a good deal. And then finally, here is some equipment setups from the Concord station that I have. This is what it really looks like when I run from this radio. This is what I'm running right here. It's just two radios on a shelf, pile of cables, and the thing usually works. The only catch is we're only as good as our internet connection. And I'm going to close that out. So that's my proposal on the California QSO party. Now, the California QSO party, I don't know why. I'm going to ask him again. One of my questions, I often dialogue with the guys that put this together. And one of those questions is, why don't you use VHF? A lot of state QSO parties, you get credit for running VHF, UHF, but not in CQP. And I'm sure the answer I'm going to get is, well, administratively, it's too complicated. Yeah, I got it. So that means that we're going to be running HF. And that's what the main presentation today is about. HF or VHF? Can you do both? I came up with this idea when I realized how many amateurs are either just technician class, so they've probably never been on HF before, or like my friend Dennis, W7AYT, who can ace the extra class exam, but can't find the RF gain control on his FT450. He bought an FT450, great little radio, good beginner's radio. And he kept saying, this thing isn't working, and there's something wrong, and blah, blah, blah. And I'd come on in, and he'd have the attenuator button pressed in 3 levels. Or he'd have the RF gain down and the audio gain up. Well, there's a way to actually do that, turn the RF gain back, but you have to know what you're doing. So basically, either way, he's shutting down, as we'll see, the front end. So we talked about that this weekend when I was there. He said, yeah, I'm great at memorizing tests. He got his father's call sign. That was what prompted him to do it. He is W7AYT from his father up in Oregon. Back when, if you moved out of the call area, you had to get a new call sign. So when they moved to California, he became W6AES. But a lady has W6AES. Her name is Alice something or other. But I noticed W7AYT, his original call sign, was available, so now he owns it. Well, HF is part of the overall radio spectrum. This picture is from the viewpoint of the United States and probably Canada. I think they call us ITU Region 2 or something like that. We're in Region 2. So we more or less all agree on this. Now, you need to study this real careful because I'm going to give a quiz at the end of this talk and you're going to need to answer. No, just kidding. However, all this junk, remember this. It was about 1912 or something like that. You can read about it in the book 200 Meters and Down. In the beginning, when we had spark gap and all that crap, and then we moved into the 20s and started getting into tubes, and the broadcast stations started up, they were, how can I say, they weren't pleased with us amateurs, let's put it that way. And they wanted to get us out the hell out of Dodge. So the Congress passed a law that banished amateur radio to 200 meters and below. That means 1.5 megahertz, the top of the broadcast band. From that point up to infinity was ours. Yeah! And they said they'll never get out of their backyard with those frequencies anyway. What was it, 2-3 years later? Amateurs are conducting transatlantic tests. ARRL threw a contest, a transatlantic contest. People in Europe, how many US call signs can you copy? People in America, how many Europe call signs? You mean I get two-way communication yet? But you are getting across the road. And immediately, this is what happened. We lost it all, except for this amount. Now this does not include our VHF, UHF, but this is our HF spectrum. 160 meters all the way up to 10 meters. Now you'll notice the frequency calculation up there. Wavelength equals 300 divided by frequency. And if you know your algebra, you also know that frequency is equal to 300 divided by wavelength. They are reciprocal. So if you want to know what frequency or what wavelength a particular frequency is on, divide that frequency into 300. Now as it turns out, it's not going to divide quite right, so we fudge it a little bit. If you divide 3.5 into 300, you get I forget what that is. You get about 3.4 megahertz or 3.3, but they round it up for us. In a general sense, technically, HF bands are 80 to 10 meters. 160 is actually a low frequency band, or a medium frequency band, not a high frequency band. It's a nitpick, that's why I put it here. 6 meters is low VHF, it's not HF, but it has so many properties like 10 meters that most radios today come with HF plus 6 meters. That's just a given. This is a station that I have access to in a place called Anza up in the San Bernardino Mountains. This is where November X-Ray 6 Tango is going to run their CQP from, and I'm going to remote in for a couple hours. This station, if you want to see more pictures, is Whiskey Alpha 6 Tango, Quebec Tango. That is where this actually is. He's got this huge piece of dirt, basically, with shrubs on it, on top of a hill in Ramona. If you look carefully, you can see stacked Yagi arrays for the high bands. Those things have incredible gain and very narrow bandwidth, or beam width. Here is stacked Yagis for 40 meters. And way in the back here, it looks like kind of a triangle or diamond shape, is what's known as a tri-square. There's a kind of antenna known as a four-square, where basically you put 4 verticals in the shape of a square, and you run phasing cables to them, and then you can literally turn a switch and switch into one of 4 directions, and you get about 90-degree beam width when you do that. This station has a 4-square for 80, it's out of the camera, but it also has one for 160. Now, a quarter-wave vertical for 160 is 130 feet high. So the fewer number of those that you can have, in case winds come through and everything wants to topple down, they've discovered that a tri-square, which is the principle of a 4-square but with only 3, gives us almost the same result. The beam width goes to 120 degrees instead of 90, but in fact I kind of like that. I ran a 160 meter contest QRP with that tri-square array. Wow, people could not believe I was running 5 watts. Now, in a general sense, the low bands, the best DX distance is at nighttime. And in a general sense, the high bands are better in the daytime. 20 meters is kind of in the middle. There are times when 20 meters in a recent contest was open all night. And in Europe, they have an easier shot of it because they got more countries right around there. So they don't need a great opening on 20 to talk to each other. They do need an opening to talk to us. Now, the secret, what makes all this work? A discovery that was made in the 20s, known as the ionosphere. There is a book on HF propagation. They keep updating it. CQ's got one and ARRL has one, and you'll see pictures like this. I stole this picture from a Kenwood R5000 shortwave receiver user manual. Forget why I was going through the manual, but I saw that picture and I'm like, God, that's beautiful. So plain, but so perfect. For radio purposes, we have 3 layers in the ionosphere. The D layer, the E layer, and then various flavors of F layer. The lower the frequency you go, in general, you're on ground wave. Broadcast stations, pretty much in the daytime, are on ground wave. Now, as the sun goes down and the ionization gets less and less, even AM broadcast stations can bounce off that D layer, and it's not unusual to turn on your AM radio at night and hear WLS in Chicago. I do it all the time. What's the one in Salt Lake City? KSL, Salt Lake City, etc., etc. However, we have other layers. On 6 meters, you may have heard the term sporadic E. I've heard that for years. I go, what the hell does that mean? Well, it means that the E layer, right here, often gets ionized in a weird way that actually makes it act like a signal duct. And a station over here, if they point their antenna just right, can get through that duct and halfway across the world. 6-meter DX does happen. And nobody quite knows the exact solar conditions out of which it happens. We know when it's happening, and we know that it happened. So people have receivers on 6 meters listening for signals 24 hours a day. Put a spectrum display on it to see if you see any blips. If so, come on into the room. For our purposes, HF, the F layer. Now, as the sun goes down, the ionization of the F layer goes down with it, and the high frequencies will just slowly fade away. As the day turns on, so tomorrow, and we come back up again, it'll fade right back in again. We can monitor the effects of band propagation. There is a scenario known as space weather. Go to spaceweather.com, for example. I wrote my own application. I like to write software. And I originally wrote this software to track the NCDXF beacon network. I gave a talk on that for this club. It may be in the video library. But I had a lot of leftover space at the bottom of the screen, and I said, I know. Let's put a space weather report here at the bottom left. And there are 3 things that I look at. SFI, solar flux index, A index, and K index. Now we want the A index and K index numbers to be low. Yesterday the K index was up to a 5. All of these goods were fares and poors. Today, the K index has gone down to a 3, but the residual effect's 49. That's very high. When we get a solar storm like this, a lot of the bands will become noisy. This is, by the way, where the DSP comes in. Really important, because that little low level of noise, it just grates away at you, and often it's caused by solar storms. Now, I've been saying for years, I think there's a conspiracy. I think the sun has a conspiracy against us, because the worst storms only happen during contest weekends, never in the middle of the week. And I want somebody to put a stop to that. Now, here's a little fascinating thing. It's called gray line. Everywhere in the world has a sunrise and a sunset. That's a guarantee. This thing keeps turning round and round. Think about who is on the other side of the world from us. If I was to point more or less northeast, who's on the other end? It turns out to be the Middle East, more or less. And you go over the top of Europe. We communicate to Europe by going over the pole. Now that pole is magnetic, so it can do some really interesting things to signals. One year, I met a Finnish ham at a DX convention, and I apologized to him for not recognizing his voice because it didn't have a flutter in it. Normally when I talk to him on the radio, his voice is wavering about because the magnetic pole is actually doing that. You know what an aurora borealis is? That aurora makes us wiggle. Nevertheless, every place on Earth at some point in 24 hours has a sunrise. This is going into Africa, is about to come into a sunrise. Parts of Europe coming into a sunrise. And while they're coming into a sunrise, we're going into a sunset. And notice that there is a dividing line. That's not just pretty artwork. This is representing the ionization of the atmosphere caused by that sun. So right an hour or two before and after sunrise and sunset, we get a ducting effect, just like we do on 6 meters with sporadic E. If you want to work some wild DX stations, start paying attention to gray line. My contest logging software has a screen like, in fact, this is. In 1mm, this is the gray line screen. I keep this gray line screen, it's just a little box on the bottom, so I know who's coming into gray line and who isn't. Often, what the Middle East is right in here, and as we move towards the West Coast, often I will hear Israel. It's the only time I can hear Israel is basically during gray line. Coming in the morning, the gray line it peaks right here in India. Just about the only way I get into India is gray line early in the morning, just as we're coming in to sunrise. Now, amateur radio, as we moved into the end of the 50s, made a transition from AM to single sideband. You can't imagine the emotional wars that went on over this. AM people, I'll die before I ever go to that Donald Duck crap. And of course, AM transmission, very inefficient. You get about 25% efficiency. Most of the power is wasted in that carrier. What if you could take the carrier away, but imply it, and leave us with the upper and the lower sideband? And that's what single sideband does. For all intents and purposes, the first company to exploit single sideband was Collins Radio. Right at the end of the 50s, they started out with the KWM1, and it was a great radio, but it sucked the way it looked. So they came up with this styling. This was the Collins styling. It looks cool, and it gives them a reason to raise the price on the radio dramatically. No offense to Collins lovers, but the performance of those radios, in my opinion, really isn't that great, but it looks good. And that's the way a lot of people look at it. Well, it was Collins, really, who brought us the transceiver. We used to have receivers and transmitters separate. A lot of people still love that. I wouldn't mind playing around with that concept again. And then behind those units are cables. So when you transmit, it mutes the receiver because you don't want to overload the front end of the receiver. Now these are tubes, you're not going to hurt anything. But today you overload a front end of a transceiver. Those are sensitive transistors and they actually can burn out. That is a problem. But these are old tube radios. Now, I want to show you some of the transceivers from that period. I'm actually going to take us on a quick close-up look. But this is the evolution. The evolution right here. These are 1960s radios. All of these. Now we start getting into the 1970s. And then we move into the 1980s. The K3 is actually very recent. And notice the price tags on some of these. $4,000 in 1989. $4,000 in 95. The 9000 was $9,500 or $11,000. The Kenwood TS990, basically, that's about $9,000. They always start out high, and then they bring the price down a little bit over the years. And there's usually bugs in it, so they get the bugs out. The later buyers actually these are some of the radios close up. This used to be a mobile radio. Tubes, but mobile. You could get about 350 watts PEP out of that. This was a classic Swan made in Oceanside. It was American made. Drake, American made. The TR3, TR4 transceivers, classics in their day. World Radio Labs came out with the Galaxy line. I had a Galaxy 300, gave me 300 watts of full of TVI RF. I tore up TVs in my apartment complex horribly with that. This 550 allegedly will run 550 watts peak. Heathkits. This was the Hot Water 101. This was the poor man's Heathkit transceiver. I calibrated this Heathkit for my friend Phil. He knew how to build. He was an impeccable solderer, but it scared the crap out of him to actually align it. And I had some test equipment, and I aligned the radio. And then he let me use it for a couple of weeks. This is Heathkit's competition to the KWM2. This is called the SB102. They had the 100, the 101, and the 102. There's also a 104 that I'll show you in a moment. These radios ran a pair of 6146B tubes, so they can get almost 200 watts out. Not too bad for those days. My first HF transceiver was called the NCX3 National. It covered 80, 40, and 20. They had the NCX5, all bands, but when the NCX3 came out, we were at the bottom of the cycle, what was that? Cycle 19, solar cycle 19. We were at the bottom. 15 and 10 weren't happening anyway. So they saved money, but this little thing, I could get almost 300 watts peak out of it. And those sweep tubes would glow like crazy. You'll notice that all these radios have an analog dial. That was the way we did it back in those days. National came out with the 5-band version of this with the mechanical digital dial. That was a first. Henry Radio sponsored a company to build this radio. It's called the Tempo 1. And they sold a lot of them. Well, the company that they contracted to was none other than Yaesu. Henry's selling the Tempo 1. Yaesu is selling the FT101. Today, Yaesu has an FT101DX or whatever. They're now hijacking the name here. But there were about a dozen different models of this FT101 throughout the 70s and 80s. People swear by them. I took a gift of an FT101 just like that to a friend. He came by my office. Somebody was giving him that radio because he was an old man. He couldn't afford the radio, and he had tears in his eyes. He said, "That's how I got started in radio, was with one of those, and I'm back home again." This is a cool radio. This is a Heathkit. The lighting, the angle is wrong, but this is a scaled down version of the Hot Water 101, but this has no tubes in it. This is solid state. That was a big deal in those days. Still an analog dial. But then Drake showed up again, and now they give us a digital dial. It's only got a 0.0. Most dials today have 0.00 or 0.000, but hey, this was amazing for its day. This was the late 70s. Yaesu countered by taking their FT101 again and coming up with the ZD, and they put a display in it. D stands for display. But they still had the analog dial on there as well. Why not? Kenwood did a lot of that. And then Heathkit came back with the SB104, the solid-state version of the SB102. I never see these for sale. I don't know whatever happened to these, but I always thought it was a kind of a cool-looking little transceiver. But then ICOM upped the ante. In the late 80s, they introduced the ICOM 780. That thing weighs about 80 pounds. Notice it's got handles on it. Yeah, you need to lift it up by its handles. I think those are metal handles, so they're not going to break. But notice what is right smack dab in the middle of the radio. A spectrum screen, allowing you to look at the spectrum on the band that you're on. I'm going to show another picture of that concept in just a moment. This was a 200-watt radio. I believe this thing was like $6,000 when it came out in the late 80s. They then upped the ante again. This is the first radio with IF DSP built in. Kenwood had this add-on box that you could plug into the back, but that don't count. But this is the first radio, the ICOM 775. Beautiful looking radio. Turns out it had a couple of weird glitches that I could never understand. You're paying over $7,000 for a radio and it's still got glitches. But it just looks cool. And it has digital noise reduction, digital notch filters, digital IF filters instead of mechanical ones. Around 2007, 2009, Elecraft, a company who sold reasonably cheap stuff, the K1 and the K2, and you could buy them as kits or you could buy them built, they introduced the K3. Prior to the K3, in radio contest circles, there were more or less 3 different transceivers being used. The Yaesu FT1000MP, which I use for field day. The ICOM 756 Pro 3, which has one of those screens on it, or maybe the Ten-Tech Orion 2. And a lot of people, to run single op 2 radios, would have 2 of those. FT1000MP is a big radio, so 2 of those takes up a lot of space. Well, Elecraft upped the ante. They introduced the K3. It's in a box, it ain't big, doesn't weigh a lot. I don't like the layout of the buttons. That's my beef, too bad. But one by one, these contest stations all dumped their ICOMs, dumped their Yaesus. I bought my Yaesu from a guy who had a pair of them. He sold them both off so he could buy a pair of these. This radio, specs-wise, is top of the line. Nothing can touch it. But I can't hear the 2 dB difference in those specs, so it means nothing to me. You can computer control this radio. That's, of course, what I do. And this is the K30 Mini that I have in my office. It's just the front panel of the K3 and a box about the size of an ICOM 705, if you've seen those units. This is the size of the Elecraft KX3, their portable QRP radio. This is exactly what is in Ramona and Anza. When I turn that tuning knob, frequency changes. When I turn on the receive incremental tuning, the RIT to tune a guy in, it gets tuned on the other end. When I press the antenna, when I press the ATU tune button, the signal is sent down the internet and the auto tuner in the radio on the other end is triggered. Elecraft just upped the ante. They've got the K4 now. It's the K3, See, the K3, you had to buy a separate pan adapter unit. The little box that sat next to it. Well, they fixed that problem. They've done what ICOM has done. And basically, they've stolen ICOM's idea. I don't know if it's better or not. I have never played with one of these. But it's the more or less layout of the K3. This radio has built-in dual receive. You can receive on 2 separate bands even. That's pretty clever. My Kenwood, or my Yaesu 2000 has dual receive in the same band. This is the FTDX 9000. They don't make it anymore. There was 3 flavors. I believe this one is actually a 400-watt version. But when to get a 400-watt version, you had to contact them in advance. They would custom make you a 400-watt version. And it was about $12,000 you're paying for custom. But it's the FT2000 and the FTDX 5000 are scaled down versions of this 9000. This is the FTDX 9000 contest radio. They got rid of that screen and they put all kinds of other knobs in there. This is actually the first medium $5,000, medium priced radio that had a spectrum and analyzer screen. What I like about this is these are speakers. So you got stereo speakers and you got the display in the middle. Today they're selling the FTDX 5000 limited. Limited means they took something away and they took away the spectrum display. Because so many people, now see in the back of this radio, like so many, you can tap out the IF and feed it into your computer, for example. I'm going to talk about the actual doing of that in just a minute. Now this is a classic radio that's taken the world by storm, the ICOM 7300. Seems like everybody I know has got an ICOM 7300. Tom, you and I have the ICOM 7000. And when we bought our 7000s, they were the in radio for ICOM at the bottom. Well, now the 7300 is the in radio, and it's got a spectrum display. I've never played with the 73. It looks a little cheesy. My ICOM 7000 had a spectrum display, but when it would update the display, it would turn the radio off. So it's completely worthless to me. This actually does it asynchronously, as I believe, but I've never tried it, so I will withhold judgment. This is the top of the line ICOM, about $10,500 bucks. The ICOM 7851 now. I got to play with the original ICOM 7800 at NX6T for about 4 months. We had one sitting as our contest operating station. It's an amazing radio, but you got to figure out all the knobs. You definitely got to RTFM on that. Read the manual. Well, Kenwood, not to be outdone, they brought us the Kenwood 990, which is close to $10,000 when you factor in taxes and shipping. And this is dual receive. And this screen actually can show different things. One of the things you can display here is actually a picture that looks like the old analog dial of the Kenwood TS520 from 1980s. So you can get an analog dial there. It's all drawn on the screen. Or if you're running dual receive, like evidently they are here, you have the main receiver and the sub receiver. And notice that the main receiver is on 40 meters and the sub receiver is on 20 meters. People that like to run single op 2 radios like to call CQ, let's say on 40 meters, and tune around on 20 meters waiting for the band to open up. I do some of that. And then Kenwood came and gave us a torn down version of the 990. This is not dual receive, which I think then it's too expensive. If you're not going to give me dual receive, then $5,000 is way too much money. But it still looks kind of pretty. You got to give them credit for that. And then Tentec, their top of the line is called the Orion 2. Always got a kick out of those orange knobs. This is a true dual receive transceiver on separate bands. Some contesters swear by this radio. I don't really like it. They're using the ICOM idea of a screen with buttons around it. I've never played with this, so I don't know how ergonomic it is. And then here's a guy, I'm going to zoom in on him. This is a guy in Indonesia, and he's got 3 classic radios happening here. This is the Yaesu FT1000MP. I have one of these. This is the Yaesu FT2000. I have one of those. But then he's got the old ICOM 7800. Notice it's got a spectrum display. And they draw the S meters on the screen. They actually don't have physical S meters. But it's just as if they were physical. So those are, that's a kind of a brief evolution of where our radios have gone. Now, wrong one. We'll try that again. This is where we left off here. While offering similar features, radios don't operate the same way. These 2 radios, Dan's Kenwood 590 and my Yaesu FT2000, they both have DSPs, they both have IF shifts, they both have some sort of contouring available. They both have dual VFOs. The only difference between, really, these 2 radios is that my radio has a dual receive. Here's VFO-A and VFO-B. The Kenwood has 2 VFOs, but you swap back and forth. You can't listen to both simultaneously. Now, every radio has 3 parts. I'm not going to go into the history of superheterodyne, and there's some interesting stories about that. Superheterodyne and superregeneration were invented by a guy named Armstrong. Major Armstrong, he was a major, I guess, at some point. Major Armstrong brought us superregenerative, and he brought us superhex. And then later on, he came up with a novel idea called FM, frequency modulation. Well, RCA didn't like that, because FM, which they didn't know anything about, threatened their AM radio monopolies. So they started suing him and violating his patent, so that he would have to sue them back. And this went on for years, just wore him down. And on a key ruling, Armstrong was convinced that he was going to lose, because RCA is too big. And to avoid the humiliation of showing up in court and having the judge go, boom, sorry, he put on his coat and his hat, and he jumped out the 13th story window of his apartment in New York City and killed himself. The next morning, the judge ruled on his behalf. True story. His wife, who they didn't get along for the longest time now, she gets everything. And she continued the lawsuits and eventually won a lot of those lawsuits. Well, it's because of Armstrong, all that to say that we have basically 3 parts of a radio. The RF, which we call the front end, the IF, or the intermediate frequency section, and then the AF, or the audio. This diagram came from the FT2000 operating manual, and it actually is a block diagram that shows you all of this. I blow it up, but it doesn't matter, because we're gonna look at this a piece at a time. If this thing will stop blinking. For example, we begin at the front end. A front end has a preamp. What is a preamp? A preamp is amplification before we do something more important. And remember rule number 1 of any amplifier circuit. What goes in the input comes out bigger on the output. So if you got signal going in, it'll be stronger signal. If you got noise going in, it'll be stronger noise. So you'll hear when we evaluate receivers, you'll hear us use the term signal to noise ratio. Turns out there's an antenna known as a beverage antenna. Beverage antenna is a wire that runs about maybe 6 foot high, 4 foot high. It's a long wire. It has to be several wavelengths long. And it's a receive antenna. It has no gain, so in fact the signals are very weak, but there's no noise either. And so it turns out the signal to noise ratio improves, and you can actually hear things. Oftentimes the only thing that's preventing us from hearing a signal properly is the noise. So preamps are a toss-up. You may or may not want a preamp. The rule of thumb is on the low bands you don't need the preamp. You got these circuits are wide open as best they can be. But as you go up in frequency, circuitry tends to lose sensitivity just a little bit. So the preamps are best turned on when you're up on 20, 15, and 10 meters and 6 meters. Now Kenwood came out with this term called IPO, intercept point optimization. And Yaesu borrowed it. It's a complicated way of saying turning the preamps on and off. You optimize the intercept point when the preamps are turned off. Period. You're going straight through, no amplification. In many cases, I like to run with amp number 1 on. That gives me approximately 10 dB added to my signal. Amp 2 takes us up to 17 dB. Now, other controls are the attenuator, ATT. The attenuator allows you to make the signals weaker. Now, the problem with the attenuator is weak signals will disappear. But if you're not interested in weak signals, by attenuating the front end a little bit, if you've got some station in your vicinity who's very loud, in Concord, there's somebody who's got a station a couple of blocks over from me, and when he tunes up his transmitter, I can hear him 50 kc up the band. He's just that loud. So I'll kick the attenuator in to knock that down, and more or less, he goes away. Yaesu, they calibrated their attenuator in 6 dB increments, 6, 12, and 18. Kenwood does it not in 6 dB, I forget, they're 5 or 10 or something. But in 6 dB increments, the accepted rule of thumb is that an S unit is 6 dB. If you get a 6 dB change in signal, you have a 1 S unit change. So I like the way that Yaesu did that. Now, Yaesu in some radios have what's called a variable RF front end. Think of that as a pre-selector. Back in the olden days, we had a pre-selector knob, and basically it's just a tunable filter that's focusing on whatever band we're on. This radio, as I switch the different bands, it switches different coils in for the front end filter. And with this knob right here, I can I can tune it off. Again, if the guy's loud, I can tune off to one side of center and he'll go away. Our goal is to clean things up as best as we can before we get here, continue to clean things up before we get to the audio. Notice all the money we spend on radios, we're spending on getting rid of stuff. Noise, interference. Now, let's move into the IF. Most modern radios today have a little RCA jack on the back. Has different names, but essentially it allows you to take the entire spectrum that that receiver is hearing, meaning the entire band, and it is able to send that data out that port. Now, you can intercept that data and run it on your computer. The K3 radio had like I said, a physical box that sat next to the radio. There was a plug-in cable between the IF out on the K3 and the pan adapter box itself. Just so happens the N1MM contest software, that's where I got this from, if you make the right connections, can give us spectrum analysis. This is 40 meters, 7024 to 7054. These spikes are signals, and notice how wide some of them are. This is pretty narrow, so I would assume that's a CW signal right there. Which one is that? That's 7034. Boy, it looks different, but at any rate, or you can get a display turning at 90 degrees. Now notice what we got over here. That looks like Morse code. Yeah, it is. So not only can we now see signals, if they are digital, Morse code, by the way, is the first digital mode, in case you didn't know that. If the signal is digital, the digital can be converted to analog and interpreted. And when we're tied into the internet and the spotting network, we then know who it is that's at this point. His call sign is NJ2BB, probably talking to, that's New Jersey, probably talking to DL3IAF, who is in Spain, and EG4OJE is in England. So it looks like from the East Coast, England was coming in whenever this particular picture was made. The East Coast has an easier shot into Europe than we do. We have to go all the way across. Likewise, we have an easier shot into Japan and Asia than they do. They have to go all the way across. Now, we tap the spectrum before anything is done to the signals. And the first thing we do on the newer radios is we have what are called roofing filters. The roofing filter takes this huge thing that we just sent to the spectrum display, and it goes whoop. And a typical roofing filter is 15 kilohertz. My Yaesu can go down to 3 kilohertz for single sideband. I can select it. The reason that we want to get narrow as we can is it immediately reduces 80% of the interference. And then we can deal with the rest of it by what's called passband shaping.
Now, the roofing filter is automatic, or do you do it?
They're actually automatic, although on my Yaesu, I can step it through 15 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz, or auto, meaning it will, if I'm on AM, it'll open it up to 15 automatically. If I'm on sideband, it'll put it down at 3. Now there's two things we want to do to improve reception. One, we want to shape the passband, but we also want to get stuff that doesn't belong there. There is a thing that, a phrase that I coined years ago. I call it the national tune-up frequency. You know what frequency the national tune-up frequency is? I'll tell you. The national tune-up frequency is any frequency that I'm running in the middle of a radio contest. Some clown comes in right next to me and goes, turns his radio on. Crap. How about saying, is the frequency in use? If nobody says anything, then maybe. But not. So, we have a thing called a notch filter. See, there, I told you, there's that guy. He's right there, right in my passband. Not real loud, but enough to be annoying. With the notch filter, notice that I can notch him right out. And he's gone. Okay, but if he moves frequency, I gotta move the notch. That's a bummer. So it turns out the modern radios today have an auto notch filter. Notice it says SSB. If you turn the auto notch filter on CW or RIDI, you won't hear any signals. I wish they would come up with an auto notch that would basically say, if the duration of the pulse is short, don't notch it. A tune-up, that just goes on forever. But nobody cares. They don't listen to me, so. But notice, here in the DSP, we're converting this analog signal into digital. Digitally, we're finding the bits that make up that beep, and we zero them out. I do the same thing when I do brain mapping for people. When I measure the front of their brain, if they blink their eyes, I get what we call eye blink artifact. In my software, and that creates something just like this. In my software, I have software that goes looking for those and compresses the data to ignore those bits. Now, a more fun way to make things more understandable is called the shift and the width facility. ICOM calls it passband tuning, PBT. And back in the mid-1980s on their R71 receiver, they came out with passband tuning, and Motorola sued them and said, you violated our patent, so they pulled the radio off the market and took out passband tuning. And then I guess later on they settled the lawsuit because now ICOM has passband tuning again. But we call it in the Yaesu world and in the Kenwood world, we call it shift, passband shift and passband width. So for example, here we have an interfering signal. If I could shift that passband to the right, he's now outside of the passband. Almost infinite dB attenuation. Now, if there's something over here, now we're moving closer to that. So it may be a mixed thing. If I go too far, now I've got QRM over here. So if I come back too far, I've got the carrier. So practice, we learn how to make it work. Another way is just shrink the whole passband, narrow it. That's what the roofing filter does. We're just doing it even more tightly. So if that signal was here and we shrink the passband, you can shrink the passband and you can shift it. You can do both. Now, we have a number of things we can do at the IF level. NB is noise blanking. DNR, digital noise reduction. Noise blanking may or may not be done inside the DSP circuit itself. My FT1000MP, the noise blanker, is outside of the DSP. On the 2000, I believe it's inside. I'll explain what that means in a moment. The digital notch filter, we saw that, the automatic notch filter. And when we've done a good enough job of, as we can, we then send it to the AF. We take the relatively weak signals and we send it to an op amp or a power transistor or two, and we get real audio, either to your headphone jack or to the speakers itself. You can put in a DSP, audio level DSP. Your Beehive is an ADSP, audio level. A lot of the modern radios, like my FT2000, allow stereo audio. So I can split the audio to left and right ear. It's great for dual receive, because VFOA I'll put in my left ear, VFOB I'll put in my right ear. So I'm working stations on VFOA, and I'm tuning the tuning knob on VFOB, looking for a voice station. And when I find one, I'll switch them over. I also use a technique called stereo CW. Take a CW signal in stereo and send it through two separate audio filters. I use a pair of Autech QF1A filters. Those filters came out in the late 70s. You will see those QF1As at the CQP setup. I bring a pair. And what happens is you set one audio filter to a lower frequency and one audio filter to a higher frequency. And experimentation, you'll learn what works for you. Then when I'm running a frequency, which is I'm calling CQ and people are calling me, they're all calling me at different offsets relative to my run frequency. So if a guy's real close to me, he'll be on my left side in my left ear. If the guy is tuned way away from me, he'll be way over here on my right ear. If I tune through a carrier, it literally goes boo, boo, and it literally drills a hole in your head. I'm also a light sound therapist, and we know about binaural beats. Look up binaural beats on Wikipedia. When you put a signal in your left ear and a signal in your right ear, you get what Armstrong called heterodyning. Hey, we're back to heterodyning again. Those signals add and subtract from each other and creates a third signal that you can hear that seems to be in the middle of your head, but it doesn't exist really. It's a binaural beat. We call it a beat signal, and this is the downside of super heterodyne. When I submit a local oscillator signal into the mixer, it's going to give me plus and minus that frequency. Well, I don't want both. I want only one. And if I get both, now I got false signals. It can be very confusing. But here's the problem. ADSP filters are great, but they have one problem. They give us an illusion that the interference has been fixed. No, that isn't true. In fact, if somebody comes on and I turn on my ADSP, my FT1000 MP has an ADSP. The sound goes away, but the S meter is still at S9 because the signal is still in the passband. And when the signal that strong comes in, my automatic gain control cuts in and cuts the gain back. So that carrier is still wreaking havoc, but I can't hear it. So ideally, and most modern radios today, put the digital notch or the automatic notch filter in the IF before the automatic gain control gets a chance to cut the gain back. So if we get rid of that carrier here, then this doesn't do anything. Now, automatic gain control, they call it fast attack and then slow decay. And we can declare slow, medium, or fast decay. The rule of thumb is If you're on single sideband, use a slow decay so that in between pauses in the voice, the signal won't be jumping up and down in level. The level will be held for a second or two while the guy continues to talk. For CW, I prefer fast. I want an immediate response to that. So today has been all about receive. Turns out we're going to be doing a part 2 on this talk, I believe at the next club meeting, and it'll be on transmit. But let me tell you a few things about transmit. Every radio has a mic gain. It's the volume control on your microphone. A lot of people love to turn those things way up. I'm kind of guilty of that. As we evolved in transceivers, we got what are called speech compressors or speech processors, circuits. If you take an average voice, this is more or less what it looks like, and you compress it, meaning you chop the tops off of it, because they don't matter anyway, and you keep the AGC going right in between each of those, whatever you want to call those parts of the waveform, you actually sound louder. You can get almost 25% more talk power with the speech processor. You see, in AM, you have a carrier, and then you're just modulating that carrier. In single sideband, the only actual power that's set out is when a voice peak is gone through. In between your voice peaks, you have nothing. With the speech processor, the circuit actually fills in that nothing. Now, if you over-advance the processor, now the guy starts sounding really too rah, 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 rah. So there's a normal place. On my Yaesu, it seems that both the mic gain and the speech processor do their best at about 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock is that magic number. As I've said, computers or radios today can be computer controlled. Everything I run has some sort of computer control. When you can get a tie-in to your computer, you can then send out data and run radio teletype and digital modes like FT4, FT8. Most radios today are still using the old DB9 port. It works, why not? And you need a special cable. They extort the price on that cable, but I learned a lesson a long time ago trying to save 20 bucks. I tried to wire my own cable and I made a mess out of it. And so I wasted 20 bucks on the materials to do that. Should have just spent 35 and got the cable, but now I let them make my cables. Let's see, so I believe we got that. And that is the, oh, I wanted to back up. Let's try that again. Yes, I got way ahead of myself here. Many radios today come with an auto tuner. The tuners are getting smaller and smaller, so more and more radios are incorporating it. Our ICOM 7000s don't have a tuner. There was no room to put it. They would have made, that thing would have gotten bigger if they put a tuner into it. So we use some sort of an external tuner. I've been using a manual MFJ tuner for years and decided that I couldn't turn those knobs over the internet. There are tuners that you can run over the internet. So I bought the MFJ 993B, and that allows me, the 993 and so many others, the minute they sense RF power, they go bam, and into tune mode immediately. We have what's called MOX versus VOX. MOX is you press the MOX button, and that's like pushing the push-to-talk switch on your microphone. VOX, voice-operated control. You just speak, it keys the radio for you. VOX is not a good idea in contest operations when you got four stations all around each other. Everybody's tripping everybody else's VOX. Field day, probably not a good idea. Better to have a push-to-talk switch on that. Break-in is for CW. Break-in means when I tap the key, it automatically goes into transmit. Break-in is the CW version of VOX, basically. Today, a lot of radios, I have to add to this slide, today a lot of radios have what's called a voice keyer built into the radio. Our ICOM 7000s have a 4-channel voice keyer. A bunch of years ago, I ran the ARRL 10-meter contest from Concord, running my ICOM 7000. We had a visit from my friend Kathy and her boyfriend. They were coming in for dinner. And before she left, I said, you know, I would like to be a multi-operator station, but I need someone else to sit down behind the microphone. So I sat her in the chair, and I taught her how to say 59 California. She made one contact on 10 meters. I'm now a multi-operator station. When in doubt, cheat within the rules. And then I went, hold it a minute. I got an even better idea. And I loaded up all 4 channels of the voice keyer with her voice. CQ 10-meter contest, Whiskey Quebec 6 X-ray. That's key number 1. Key number 2, your 59 California. Key number 3, thank you, QRZ, WQ6X. And function key 4, Whiskey Quebec 6 X-ray. She goes away to Santa Cruz, that's where she lives. I ran for the next 30 hours of the contest. When I was on sideband, I ran with her voice.
Yeah, but I've been listening on the air, you know, and
What's that?
I've been listening to this 66 QSO.
Oh yeah, the Route
US
66 party.
They-
A lot of
Those
women.
guys are doing that, and they only give 5.9 as a report all the time, so it's all, they're not listening to it.
Yeah, oh, of course. But a couple of times.
And they can't be 5.9 all the time.
Well, no, the 5.9 is automatic, everybody's 5.9, which is why I've been petitioning the contest organizations, take the signal report out. California QSO party, we don't send 5.9, we send a number and we send the county, that's the way you do it. Now, the problem with this technique was that occasionally somebody would ask a question that's not in my voice keyer.
Yeah.
So I'd pick up the mic and I would go, well, you're supposed to do it this way. Of course, I can do Geraldine. But if my voice cracks, they know I ain't Geraldine. They know that. And then the guy says, hey, where's the YL, man? You cheated us. But voice keyers are now de facto the way we do things. Calling CQ, man, you gotta wear your voice out. But you just press key number 1, key number 1. In 1MM software, the first 4 function keys coincide with the first 4 digital voice keyer channels of most radios. I press F1, you'll hear, when I press F1 for the QSO party, you'll hear QRZ, the California QSO party. This is kilowatt 6, Quebec, London, Foxtrot. And I'll record that, and then every time I just play that out. So we have a lot of cool things that we can do from that. Now most radios have 2 VFOs, VFO-A, VFO-B. And this allows us to run like we had a separate transmitter and receiver. We call that split. I receive on VFO-A, and I can tell my radio to transmit on VFO-B. There's a button, A into B, which will copy the frequency and the mode and everything of VFO-A into B. And then a lot of times the DX station will say, I'm up 5. Or he'll say, listening up 5. So whatever his frequency is, I put that in A, and I memo it into B, and then I tune VFO B up 5 kC, and I say transmit on B and listen on A. Now, in the case of the FT2000 and dual receive radios, now I can actually have both radios. A and B now become a radio, not just a VFO. However, RIT versus exit. A lot of times in a radio contest, somebody will put me in the spotting net, but they'll put the wrong frequency in. They'll be off by 200 cycles. So a guy calls in and he's real high frequency. I used to say, "You're off frequency, man, tune me in." No, nobody's got time for that crap. And plus it makes me the grumpy old man, right? So I turn on the RIT, receive incremental tuning, and I tune him in. So he sounds right. The N1MM software has a command in it that says clear RIT. So when I log the contact, it then puts the RIT back to 0 again, which is really nice. You can also do exit, which is just make your transmit frequency higher or lower than what you're currently listening to. Kind of like using VFO-B, but exit, you only have to have one VFO to do that. Practice, 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 and you'll figure this stuff out, and it'll blow your mind. And then power level. Most radios today are 100 watts, although there's a whole bunch of 5 and 10 watt radios the Chinese are coming out with. And ICOM has the 705, Elecraft has the KX3. But in general, most HF radios are 100 watts, and you can dial them down to 5 watts. QRP is 5 watts and less. People often are surprised when I'm running QRP for Manza or Ramona. I'll be 20 over S9 up in Minnesota, and I'll say, "I'm running QRP." "No way you're running QRP. You're too loud." "Yeah, well, I got an antenna 55 feet in the air, and it's a Yagi with 8 dB gain." Yeah, not surprising. Run your decibel numbers and you'll realize that's not that big of a deal at all. But here's the problem. A lot of people, when they go and tune up, they say, "Well, I was only running 5 watts, so I didn't think anybody could hear me." I work into Europe on 5 watts from Ramona. Not a problem. I call CQ and they came back to me. They're hearing me. 5 watts can go a long ways. But you know what else I learned? Don't rely on the little watt display on your radio. When I first started powering down my FT2000 to what said was 5 watts, and I went, okay, 5 watts. And then I brought in the MFJ 993B tuner, which has got a watt meter built into it. The MFJ told me I was only putting out 3.5 watts. So all this time I've been running what I thought was 5 watts, I was only running 3.5 watts. So now when I run QRP on the FT2000, I let the tuner tell me when I'm at 5 watts. I ignore the radio. Yeah, it turns out the radio says I'm running 7 watts, but the tuner says I'm only running 5. Power level is very interesting. In radio contests, most people run low power, some run amplifiers. In low power, the competition is fierce, but if you go down to 5 watts QRP, 80% of the competition goes away. I've been winning a lot of certificates, and I got a plaque for the 7th Area QSO party from May, running mixed mode sideband CW QRP, and I was the best QRP station outside of the 7th call area. Woody Allen used to say, sometimes just showing up is half the battle. Yep. I tell people in contests, always submit a log. There was one year in the beginning in the sweepstakes, I didn't submit a log, and the guy who I thought was going to win got disqualified. So in fact, if I had submitted, in those days they were handwritten logs. Horrible process. Today our logs are saved by the computer in a format known as Cabrillo format. and that is the standard for the contest committees. You submit a Cabrillo file. When we're done here with California QSO Party, I'm gonna make a Cabrillo file from your laptop, I'm gonna make a Cabrillo file from my laptop, and they submit it, and then they inhale these files into a database. And they can immediately tell, if I say I worked WQ5L at such and such a time, his log better reflect that. If not, I get dinged. It's called NIL, not in log. But not only do I have to get it at the right time, whatever information he sent me, I have to have logged carefully. In the California QSO Party, we send number and county. So if you log somebody and he said his number was 204 and you typed in 24, you don't get it. You get dinged for that. If you put in the wrong county, you get dinged for that, etc., etc. But that's all possible. That's all possible. Oh, are we back out of it? Okay. That is all possible because we can computer control these radios. 40 years ago, I ran the All Asian DX contest using an ICOM 740 from my office in Manhattan Beach. They had construction going and the roof was open. I could get up to the roof. I put a 8JK double dipole array up on the roof, nobody saw it, and I wrapped the cables around their power cords going down the stairwell, nobody saw that, and I ran the coax into my cubicle, and I knew the rounds that the guard would make, so when I knew the guard would be coming through, I turned the lights off. I ran a contest, 48 hours, and I did it from there because I wanted to use our MV 10,000 computer. I wrote some logging software for it. It would check for duplicate contacts. Type in a call sign and it would tell you if it talked to you before. In those days, nobody used computers, and so I was afraid it might be considered cheating if they found out that I used a computer, so I didn't say anything. Today, if you don't use a computer in a radio contest, you don't stand a chance. And however you do it, if you want to submit a log, you eventually got to convert it. Even if you type it manually, you got to convert it into a Cabrillo file. That's all they will accept. But no problem. All the logging, the good logging programs are free. N1MM is a free program. I heartily recommend it. Others are slightly different, and you pay some money for them. But that is this presentation. Now, let me ask the question, are there any questions? I'm sure I've left you with all kinds of stuff. I'll just put our screen back.
Let's see, Ron, on the antenna tuners, they have a power rating usually, a number of watts that they
Yeah,
handle.
the radio, the built-in to the radio ones, of course, can handle the radio. My MFJ 993B can handle up to 300 watts. They make a 600 watt version of that. You pay another $200 or $300, and then they make a 1500 watt version of that for
So
about $1,000.
how do you decide how many watts you really need?
Well, see, that's just it. A lot of people think you got a pile of power, you know, and read the Part 97 of the FCC rules. It says we're only allowed to use enough power to make a communication. Yeah. So you got some jackass who's putting on a 1.5 kilowatt amplifier to talk to his buddy down the street. Not necessary. You can run 5 watts.
Well, some tuners will be more effective at taking a bad signal and clarifying.
Sure.
What would you look for, like, which would have a greater range of operation? So they could deal with, well, for example, if you had a random wire antenna, you might need a tuner that would have the capabilities of fixing wildly out.
The 993B allows me, you can run a single line, you can run, there's 2 terminals also on the back, you can run ladder line, I'm running ladder line, and it's got another antenna jack, so you can have a second antenna, and that's coax. And a button on the front allows me to switch between the ladder line antenna 1 and whatever is on that coax. And that coax, I have an antenna switch either to a Yagi or a vertical.
Right, I was wondering, well, if we had just like a random wire,
Yeah, that tuner will
it
tune
might
that.
be wildly, wildly out of sync.
Your radio probably wouldn't tune that, but the tuner will tune that,
Okay.
and your radio will tune into the
Okay.
tuner.
But are there tuners that would have a wider range of?
That's what the 993B is for.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I use it, exactly. That thing can match just about anything. That tuner, that 993B tuner, allows me to take a 10-meter Yagi and tune it on 15 meters like it's a buddy pole.
Okay,
And then I can rotate that thing.
okay. Well, Ron, actually, you were talking about buddy poles, and one of the things I'd like for us to do is to, I'll bring in the buddy pole and do stuff. Because it has such a narrow, because it's a small.
Right.
Physically small, it has a very narrow passband, so pretty much everything is going to be beyond what the.
Right.
What the 590 can handle.
Ideally, you would want a manual tuner in between the buddy pole and the radio.
What
No.
about the 993?
Yeah, or if you have a 993, yeah.
Right. So-
For the short term, I have my old MFJ tuner, and you could make use of that to get started to see what that's like.
Well, actually, I'm gonna go ahead and probably buy.
Okay, yeah, well, I've been very pleased with it, it was a good buy. And yeah, I highly recommend it, because it's automatic.
Yeah, oh, right, so basically, if we had, for example, let's say we had the buddy pole set up roughly working on 40, and then we tune it on 40 with the tuner, could we then actually use that for a 20-meter or a 15-meter?
You might well be able to, because that antenna tuner has a wide range. See, that's because you're doing the same thing I did with the 10-meter Yagi on 15.
Right,
The tuner is just getting all the reactants balanced out, and then who knows how much RF is actually squirting off that thing. But I was able to work in the Texas QSO party this weekend on 15 meters. I pointed the 10-meter Yagi due east, and I got 9 Texas stations. So a 10-meter antenna with that 993B is able to make it do. That 993B has even tuned that 10-meter Yagi in 20 meters. I wasn't very loud. It's probably getting just a squirt of RF, but just to prove that it could be done.
okay. So if we were receiving information on a mismatched antenna using the 993, would we better hear the information?
You'll hear a difference, yeah.
But what we send out might be so attenuated that there'd be very little actual power
Right.
going out.
But you'll notice the difference. Notice when I gave the demonstration earlier, I went and before I said I'm gonna listen, I hit the MOX button, sent some RF into the tuner so it goes blah, and now it's tuned right there for that band. Prior to that, the tuner was set for who knows where, and I couldn't hear anything. But when you go the ACOM 2000A kilowatt amplifier, I love that damn thing. It's a big box, it's got a tuner built in, and when you hit a transmit button, you'll hear it go BOOM! And then it's tuned, just like that. Now you pay $6,000 for that tuner, but it's for that amplifier, but it's really cool. And if you don't mind, the first time it bonked at me at 3 o'clock in the morning, I jumped. Not only that, a couple of weeks later, I had a Centurion amplifier sitting to my left, about 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm tuning around the band, calling CQ, nobody coming back to me. This is boring. And then all of a sudden, BOOM! This big fireball shoots out the amp, and the amp shuts down. I went, wow, what the hell is that all about? So I called the grumpy bear, he's only if it's an emergency, because we had just put a new plug on that. And he said, well, you're gonna have to take the plug off and put it back on the other amplifier. So I did all that. And it turned out a faulty feed-through capacitor had failed. And so when I wasn't transmitting, voltages were building up and building up on the plates of those tubes, and finally built up so much that it arced over, which was the fireball that I saw, and then the whole thing shut down. So it was a $5 component. We got the amplifier going, but let me tell you, I was nodding off until that happened. Now I'm awake for the rest of the morning. Little sideline. But amplifiers with tuners, wonderful things. Any other questions?
Ron, I have a
Yes.
question. I've been looking at some different antenna analyzers, and there's some that are expensive and some that are cheap, and I'm wondering how do you decide?
I use the MFJ 259, they're not cheap either. What do they want, $300 or something like that for that? Dan has one, I don't know how much you paid for that.
It's 400.
Yeah, see?
Yeah, but we'll
Yeah,
be-
now,
but it has the display. which
yeah,
is-
yeah,
which is-
well, there are some Chinese knockoffs, if you go on eBay and eHam and stuff, that have all that fancy display, but they're Chinese, you know, they're like the bow phones of the antenna analyzers, basically.
And I'll be bringing this in, so next month.
Yeah, you can
we're
see
gonna
how
set
it's
that
done.
up, Because especially working with the little buddy pole, you pretty much have to have an antenna analyzer, because there's no way to really tell
Yeah.
what your residence is.
Unless you just operate at the lowest SWR of that antenna. You gotta, you know, that dip, you gotta operate at that dip without a tuner. That antenna was tuned, remember that you showed me the graph this morning?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So that's where it's tuned, and it'll tell you what frequency that antenna, we used to cut them, you
But
know?
but I actually did that, so to get that information, I actually manually.
Right, you
adjusted
changed the length of
Yeah, I
the
changed the length.
radiators, yeah.
And then that was, so I would have to remember, and actually I wrote down.
But
what I
that,
got.
I remember, when I was doing it on my car, you'd have to say, okay, here's the notch, this is, I don't know how many KCs you'd go up and down on
Right,
40
right.
meters, but that's how he tuned it, because I didn't have a
Buddy
tuner.
pull is an experiment, you find the right
Yeah,
point to clip it,
Yeah,
and then you write that down,
right.
just like we do on kilowatt amplifiers. We tune them properly for each band, and then we put little color dots that says 80 meters, 40 meters,
Yeah.
20 meters, so you can just go boom, and you're right there without a hitch.
and I wanted, are you still recording?
So, this is HF.
Great.
I know as much about HF as you guys know about VHF. I can learn VHF from y'all, but I'm an HF, because I started in HF. When I started, VHF was crude and crummy by today's standards, it was expensive. Now, it's the other way around. I will see y'all at our next installment, part 2. We'll be at the ARCA club meeting coming soon, at a theater near you.
All right, very good. Thanks, Ron. Boy, that's a lot of information.